The impact hit him before the falling stopped, which means his brain did not have time to prepare his body for what stone floor at 20 meters of vertical drop does to legs and pelvis. And the sound his bones made in that moment was not the sound that bones make in movies. It was not a crack or a snap. It was a sound like furniture being broken, like a chair being slammed against a floor until it stops being a chair, dense and wet and final. And then the light was gone. Not dimming, gone. As if someone had reached up and turned off the sun. He was on the floor of an abandoned gold mine shaft in the Australian Outback, and the darkness was absolute, and his legs were destroyed, and the silence above him was the silence of a desert that did not know he was there. This is the human limit. I am your host. If you have the psychological endurance for stories about what happens to a human mind when the body is broken, and the darkness is total, and the silence stretches into days, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button, because what I am about to describe is not just a physical survival story. It is a story about the mind dismantling itself in the dark, about what the brain does when it has no input to work with, no light, no sound, no sensation except pain, and about what one man had to become to still be alive 14 days after a wooden plank gave way beneath his boots and dropped him into the 19th century. He was an experienced outdoorsman. That is always the first thing that has to be said about stories like this, and it always has to be said not to assign blame, but to establish the baseline from which the fall, literal and otherwise, occurred. He had walked the Australian interior for years. He knew the outback the way a person knows a landscape they have moved through in all seasons and all conditions, with the specific respect that familiarity with dangerous terrain produces, the knowledge that the land will not accommodate mistakes in the way that cities do. He carried a satellite locator beacon on previous trips. He had left it in the car on this one. A decision so ordinary it barely registered at the time. He was going for a walk. He would be back by evening. The wooden planks that covered the mine shaft were more than 100 years old. Gold Rush-era timber, dropped across the opening by miners who had finished with the shaft and moved on, covered over the decades by the slow drift of desert sand that fills and smooths and erases the evidence of human activity in the outback, the way water fills and smooths a depression in sand at low tide. The planks were not visible. The ground looked like ground. He stepped on it with his full weight, and the wood, which had been dry and brittling for a century, gave way in a single moment that offered no warning and no option. 20 meters is far enough to reach lethal velocity under gravity. It is far enough that a person falling through it has approximately 2 seconds of awareness before impact. 2 seconds in which the body's alarm systems are activated, and the body does nothing useful with that activation because there is nothing useful to do. 2 seconds of understanding what is happening and being unable to affect it. He hit the rock floor of the shaft at the bottom, and his legs took the impact, and then his pelvis took what the legs transmitted upward, and the structural failure cascaded through him in the fraction of a second it takes for force to travel through bone. Both femurs, the tibiae, the pelvis fractured in 2 places. He was conscious. That was the first terrible fact of the situation. He was conscious, and the pain was immediate and comprehensive, and of the kind that the word pain is inadequate to describe. Not because language has no words for extreme pain, but because extreme pain at this level occupies the entire available processing capacity of the nervous system, and does not leave room for the construction of language to describe itself while it is happening. He lay on the rock floor in the absolute dark, and what he experienced in those first minutes was not thought in any recognizable form, but sensation, pure and overwhelming, the body reporting damage at a volume that excluded everything else. And then the darkness. He had fallen 20 meters in a vertical shaft, and the opening above him was a circle of light approximately 2 meters in diameter at the top, and the light that came through that circle was the indirect light of an overcast outback morning. Not direct sunlight, and 20 meters of vertical distance and the geometry of the shaft combined to reduce that light to something that, by the time it reached the floor, was essentially indistinguishable from darkness. He could not see his hands in front of his face. He could not see the walls. He could not see the extent of the space he was in. He could not see. He screamed. Every person in this situation screams. It is not a decision. It is not a strategy. It is the body expressing its condition through the most basic channel available. He screamed, and the shaft walls carried his voice upward and through the small opening at the top and into the desert air above, and the desert air absorbed it the way the desert absorbs everything, without acknowledgement, without echo, without any indication that the sound had been registered by anything capable of response. He screamed for a period he cannot accurately estimate. He screamed until the screaming cost more than the silence, and then there was only the dark. The physics of what happens to a human mind in total darkness over time is documented and disturbing. The brain is an input processing organ. Its fundamental operation is the reception of sensory data and the construction of a model of reality from that data. When sensory data stops arriving, the brain does not go quiet. It does not simply wait for more input. It generates its own. It begins to produce sensations, perceptions, experiences from internal sources, from memory and pattern and the firing of neurons that have no external stimulus to respond to and fire anyway. This is not metaphor. This is neurology. The dark does not produce nothing. It produces something worse than nothing. In the first hours, he focused on the physical inventory because the physical inventory was real, because pain is information, and information is something to work with. He cataloged his injuries through sensation alone. The legs were not responding to voluntary movement in the normal way, which told him what the pain had already told him about their structural integrity. Moving them produced levels of pain that shut down the attempt to move them before it completed. The pelvis, when he tried to reposition even slightly, produced a pain that rose above the baseline of all the other pain, in the way that a separate alarm sounds distinct from background noise. He understood he was not walking out. He understood this with the clarity that extreme physical circumstances sometimes produce, a stripping away of denial that leaves only the functional assessment. He could not walk. No one knew where he was. He had no communication device. He had the clothes on his back, a small pack that had survived the fall beside him, containing approximately half a liter of water and 2 protein bars. The water lasted 14 hours. He rationed it. Of course he rationed it. Every person who has ever read anything about wilderness survival knows that you ration water. He rationed it with the discipline of someone who understood dehydration timelines, and understood that the half-liter he had was the entirety of what he had, and that the human body requires approximately 2 liters per day under normal conditions, and substantially more under the conditions of trauma and stress he was experiencing. He made the half-liter last 14 hours, and then it was gone. Dehydration in a trauma patient is not the same as dehydration in a healthy person. The body in trauma has elevated fluid demands from the injury response, from the inflammation, from the metabolic cost of managing pain at this level. He was thirsty in a way that intensified faster than the textbook says it should have, faster than he expected based on his experience, the specific intensifying thirst of a body that is managing catastrophic physical damage and running out of the resources it needs to do so. On the second day, he found the moisture on the walls, or rather, he felt it. He could not see it. He pressed his palm against the rock face near him, and the rock was not dry. The limestone and quartz formations of old Australian mine shafts often hold moisture. Condensation from the temperature differential between the cool shaft interior and the warmer surface, seepage from deep geological layers, water trapped in mineral formations over geological time. The moisture was there, minimal, distributed across the surface of the stone in a film that required dragging his tongue across the rock to collect. He dragged his tongue across the rock. The minerals in those walls were not neutral. The geology of old gold mine shafts often includes arsenic compounds, heavy metal deposits, oxidized sulfur formations. Licking the walls of an abandoned gold mine shaft is not safe hydration practice by any measure. He knew this. He was not in a position to prioritize safe hydration practice over hydration, and so he licked the walls and collected what he could, and did not think about what he was ingesting, because what he was ingesting was the alternative to dying in 2 days, instead of potentially dying in 2 weeks, and 2 weeks was the direction he needed to be oriented. The insects arrived by the end of the second day. The base of old mine shafts is not sterile. It is an ecosystem, a limited one but functional, built around whatever organic material finds its way to the bottom over the decades. Beetles, centipedes, things that he could not identify by touch and did not try to identify by species, only by the sensation of movement on his skin, the specific texture of something with too many legs moving across his legs that could not move to remove them. He ate them. This is the sentence that requires a moment to sit with. He ate them. Centipedes in the Australian interior can carry venom, can cause pain and illness in normal circumstances, are not a food source any person would choose. He was not choosing. He was accepting what the environment provided, and the environment, in the absence of any better offering, provided insects, and insects provide protein and moisture and calories, and protein and moisture and calories were what the difference between dying sooner and surviving longer required. He learned to catch them by feel, to wait for the sensation of movement, and then to close his hand around the source of movement, and then not to think about what was in his hand before it was no longer in his hand. This required a quality of dissociation from the normal categories of acceptable and unacceptable that he describes as the dismantling of a wall he had not known was there until he needed to dismantle it. The hallucinations began on the 4th day. He knew what they were. He had read enough about sensory deprivation to recognize the mechanism when it started operating. This did not make them easier to manage. Knowledge of what a hallucination is does not automatically provide the experiential leverage to treat it as less than real while it is occurring. The brain does not have a reliable mechanism for distinguishing between internally generated experience and externally generated experience when the distinction has not been maintained by ongoing external input. When the external input stops, the distinction becomes unreliable, and then unreliable becomes impossible. The first hallucinations were auditory, voices, not random sounds but voices, specific and directed. Voices that seemed to be speaking to him from a source he could not locate within the darkness around him. He knew intellectually that there were no voices. He could not make his nervous system agree. The voices spoke in patterns that felt meaningful without resolving into meaning. The specific quality of hallucinated speech that sounds almost like language, while remaining something that cannot be transcribed. He answered them. He reports this without embarrassment because embarrassment requires an audience that understands the standard being violated, and in the shaft there was no audience. There was only him and the dark and the voices, and answering the voices was better than the silence. The visual hallucinations began on the 6th day. Light. In the absolute dark he began to see light. Not the imaginary light of closed eyes, the phosphine patterns that the optic system generates from its own activity, but structured light, the hallucination of actual illumination in the shaft, panels of light that suggested walls and openings and pathways that did not exist. He moved toward one on the 7th day. He pushed himself through the agony of movement across the stone floor toward a light that his brain had constructed from nothing. Across approximately 3 meters of floor before the light resolved into darkness and he understood what had happened. The movement across those 3 meters took an hour and a half. He describes the pain of moving with shattered femurs and a fractured pelvis across a stone floor as something that should require more words than exist for pain to describe. The bones moved within the tissue as he moved. There is no comfortable way to phrase that. The structural elements that define the shape and function of the lower half of his body were no longer structural, were fragments of their former configuration, and when he moved, they moved with him in ways that fragments of former configurations move, which is not the way bones are supposed to move. He continued moving because the light had seemed real, and continuing was the only category of action available. When he reached the darkness where the light had been, he lay still for what he believes was several hours. The shaft had no day and night. The circle of light at the top did not provide enough illumination to create a meaningful cycle below. He lost track of time in a way that has a clinical name in the research on confined isolation: temporal disorientation, the loss of the internal clock that normally synchronizes with external light cues. He did not know if he had been in the shaft for 3 days or 6. He did not know if it was day or night on the surface. He did not know if anyone had reported him missing or if anyone knew he had gone for a walk at all. He constructed a routine. This is one of the most significant details in his account, and it is one of the least dramatic, which is perhaps why it carries as much weight as it does. In the chaos of hallucination and pain, and darkness and hunger, and the slow poisoning of whatever he was collecting from the walls, he made a routine. He assigned to himself fixed intervals of activity: wall licking, insect hunting, repositioning to distribute pressure, voice exercises, counting. Not counting toward anything, just counting, forward, indefinitely, to maintain the operation of the counting function, to keep the part of the brain that handles sequential logic exercised in the same way that moving the arms periodically prevents the muscles from losing function entirely. He counted to 10,000 and started over. That is not metaphor. He counted, in the dark, with broken legs, in the 14th day of total isolation, to 10,000. And then he started again. Because the alternative was to stop counting, and stopping counting meant letting the routines go, and letting the routines go meant letting the last structures that separated organized thought from the hallucinations take over completely, and he was not willing to let that happen. Not yet. He was willing to let a lot of things happen that he would not have been willing to let happen before the plank gave way. He was not willing to let that happen. The physical deterioration was compressing the timeline. 14 days without adequate hydration and nutrition and medical treatment for the injuries he had sustained was not survivable indefinitely. He understood this. The minerals he was ingesting from the walls were accumulating in ways his body was reporting through symptoms that overlapped confusingly with the symptoms of starvation and dehydration and the effects of sensory deprivation. He was not able to determine with certainty which symptoms were which. His hands were showing changes in sensation that might have been peripheral neuropathy from mineral accumulation, or might have been circulation compromise from the injuries, or might have been something else entirely. What he knew was that the timeline was closing. He could feel it the way you feel when a room is slowly losing air, not through dramatic change, but through the accumulation of small signals, each individually dismissible, collectively undeniable. The fatigue was different on day 12 than it had been on day 6. The hallucinations were more persistent and less distinguishable from reality on day 13 than they had been on day 9. The counting was harder to maintain. The intervals between coherent thought were lengthening. He was moving toward something, and the something was not rescue. On the 14th day, he heard a different sound. He almost did not respond to it. The hallucinations had trained him to treat unexpected sounds with skepticism, to wait and assess before reacting, because reacting to a hallucinated sound had costs, and he had learned to manage his energy budget with the precision that a dwindling resource requires. He heard what sounded like voices, which was not distinguishable from the experience of the previous 12 days. He did not call out immediately. Then he heard the mechanical sound. Not a voice, something with an engine. Something with moving parts of metal that produced a frequency his nervous system could not generate internally because his nervous system had no template for mechanical frequencies of that specific kind. A generator, perhaps, or a vehicle, something from the surface world, something real. He called out. What came out of him was not the controlled vocalization of someone attempting to produce a sound that carries efficiently upward through a vertical shaft. It was everything that had accumulated in 14 days, everything the darkness had compressed and the pain had sharpened and the hallucinations had distorted and the counting had tried to maintain, released through his vocal cords in a sound that he cannot describe and does not try to. The light came after a time he cannot measure, not sunlight, a beam from a handheld light source, a flashlight or a headlamp, directed down the shaft from the opening 20 meters above. Not intended for him specifically, not aimed by someone who knew he was there, but part of a search pattern in an area where a man had been reported missing by his family after he failed to return from a walk. A search that had been conducted in expanding circles for 6 days before it reached this part of the desert. Before someone on the search team happened to approach the opening of a mine shaft that looked to the surface like nothing more than a depression in the sand, and directed their light downward and heard something respond. He saw the beam and he understood what it was. He understood it with the specific clarity of a mind that had spent 14 days parsing the difference between internal and external experience, and knew immediately that this beam was external, was real, was from a source that existed in the world above the shaft, and not in the construct his brain had been building in the dark. He called again. The beam moved. It was not random. It was directed by someone who had heard something. It swept the walls of the shaft and found him on the floor of it, 20 meters down, and the person holding the beam called back, and the voice was real in a way that the voices of the previous 14 days had not been real. Real in a way the nervous system recognizes without being told, because real has a quality that internally generated does not. A quality that the brain cannot fully replicate no matter how comprehensive the deprivation has become. The extraction took several hours. You do not pull a person with shattered femurs and a fractured pelvis up 20 meters of vertical shaft quickly. You do it carefully, with equipment, with the coordination of a team, with the specific engineering of improvised rescue systems that the search team constructed at the top of the shaft while he lay at the bottom and understood for the first time in 14 days that someone knew where he was. He does not describe the ride up in detail. He describes the first sight of the sky. The overcast Australian sky on an afternoon in the interior is not remarkable from any aesthetic standpoint. It is a particular shade of pale that carries the specific quality of a sky seen through thin cloud in a latitude without the atmospheric depth of the tropics or the dramatic clarity of high altitude. He describes it as the most beautiful thing he has ever seen, and he uses the word beautiful, knowing that it is the wrong word for what he means. That beautiful is a word for aesthetic experience, and what he felt seeing that sky was not aesthetic, was not in the category of beautiful things, was in the category of things that do not have words, because words are constructed by minds that operate in the world, and this experience was the return to the world of a mind that had been operating elsewhere for 14 days. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks. The femurs required surgery. The pelvis required surgery. The mineral accumulation from the wall moisture required treatment that extended the hospital stay beyond what the orthopedic injuries alone would have required. The doctors who treated the accumulation did not express surprise that he had survived ingesting what he had ingested. They expressed the specific restrained quality of surprise that medical professionals produce when they encounter something that the textbooks do not fully account for, and that professional decorum prevents them from describing as miraculous. He has spoken publicly about what happened to his mind in the shaft on several occasions, with the specific reluctance of someone who is not sure the public framework for discussing psychological experience is adequate to what he is trying to describe. He says, "The dark does not go away, not the specific dark of the shaft, which is a physical thing, and ended when the sky came back. The other dark, the one the shaft built inside me out of 14 days of nothing to look at. That one is still there, in certain conditions, in certain qualities of light or lack of it, and I have had to learn to function with it the way you learn to function with any permanent change to the structure of the self, which is not by accepting it exactly, and not by fighting it exactly, but by developing a relationship with it that acknowledges what it is, without being defined by it." He does not ski in the mountains. He does not walk in isolated terrain without communication equipment. He does not enter spaces where darkness is a possibility without a light source and a backup light source and a third. These are not phobias in the clinical sense. They are the adaptations of a nervous system that has updated its threat model based on 14 days of revised data and will not be updating it back. He counts sometimes, not to 10,000, not anymore. Just to 100, and then back down, and then back up. He does it when the dark he described is present, when the conditions that approximate what the shaft produced in him are present in the ordinary world. He says it does not make the dark go away. He says it makes him the person counting in the dark, rather than the person the dark is happening to. He says that is the distinction that kept him alive. That is the human limit. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, tell me at what point you believe your mind would have let go, which day you think the counting would have stopped, how you imagine the silence of 14 days of absolute dark would change the structure of your thinking. I read every single comment. I will be back with another story from the place where human beings discover the actual boundary of what the self can sustain before it stops being the self and becomes something else. The shaft is still there. The desert does not mark it. The sand moves over it and away from it and back, and the opening is visible only to someone who knows to look for it, and most people do not know to look for it. And the 19th century miners who sank it knew to look for it, and they are gone, and the shaft remains, open, 20 meters deep, waiting with the patience of geology for whatever the surface chooses to deliver into it next. He is not in it. He is somewhere above the ground, in the light, counting.